Steve Bennick is here with lots of guests. Steve, thanks for coming on the show today.
Hey, thanks, Kelly. Thanks for having us.
Tell us a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today.
Well, this is kind of part two. If listeners remember a week or two ago when we had the first batch in from St. Cloud State University. So these are grad students that are going to be talking about a big anniversary coming up, St. Cloud State 150.
That's pretty exciting. And they're each basically doing a separate decade.
You are correct.
That's pretty exciting. So with us today is Blake Johnson, Lance Sternberg, and Kyle Imdeck. Did I say it all right?
You got it, Kelly.
Got it.
Nailed it.
$100,000 award for that somewhere I'm going to find. But you guys are each covering a different decade. So I guess we'll start with Kyle. Kyle Imdeck is going all the way back to the 1930s.
That's right.
Did you get to choose the decade that you wanted to look at, or did they kind of say, hey, you're doing this, you're doing this, you're doing this?
We started at the beginning of the semester. Each of us got to choose our own individual decade. So
Okay.
the 30s was what I wanted to target.
That's where you wanted to go. Was there a specific reason you wanted to pick the 30s?
I guess I'm just sort of fascinated by the Depression, New Deal sort of era.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about what you found. I mean, I know you don't want to give everything away, but was there anything that you went, wow, I had no idea these facts were around the 1930s?
Well, the history of St. Cloud State in the 1930s goes against what you might expect from the Depression era. There is some of the budget cuts that happened early in the decade, but through most of the decade, the college itself is actually growing. There's new properties being acquired, new buildings being built. The wall at Selke Field is constructed during then as a sort of WPA partnership project. And in addition to that, besides new buildings being constructed, student culture is really flourishing during the time period. Students are flocking to band and choir groups in numbers going up to the hundreds. There's new groups being formed like the International Relations Club, which had over 100 members. And speakers of international renown are coming to campus as well, including Carl Sandburg, the poet and biographer, and this character named Maulana Shaukat Ali, who was a leader in India's independence movement that came over during the decade.
It's interesting. It's almost like they were like, you know what, we're trying to stay positive and we want to move forward and we want to keep everything on the up and up. It sounds like they were really trying to be forward thinkers.
Right. That's the impression that I got as well.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, I guess I wouldn't expect anything less from a university because that's sort of what we see as students always trying to look forward. But in that particular era, I would have thought that it would have been more of a downtime.
Right. You always get this doom and gloom impression of the 1930s. You know, when we think of the Midwest in the 30s in particular, we think Dust Bowl, starving farmers, this kind of thing. St. Cloud State's story, from what I found, is in many ways exceptional to that.
That is pretty exciting. Very interesting. Okay, let's go into the 1950s, right? That's next. Blake, you get to choose your era as well? Was there a specific reason, or...?
There was no specific reason. I ended up, if I remember correctly, getting last pick. So I got the 50s by default.
By default. Did you find anything super interesting about that era?
Well, when we look at the 1950s, a lot of people tend to think of it as this consensus era. If they know more about the 1950s, they'll see it as entry into the Cold War and the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. Mm-hmm. There are other things going on in that period, women entering the industrial workforce, and the university, or the teachers' college at that time, was shaping its identity through these events. They are seeking accreditations as an institution from different women's groups and educational groups, things like that. There's a lot of discussion in the college newspaper about different events. Women entering a shop class at Riverview High School becomes a big deal. The good old days are gone, according to the reporters. So
interesting, yeah, and how times have changed since then. What was there? Was there one specific thing you went, wow, how about that? I had no idea, and you found it just fascinating about the 1950s.
It's not necessarily a significant event, but there is a lot of debate about religion and religion's role on campus. Mm-hmm. And there was actually an article in the Chronicle talking about a UFO sighting. And this UFO sighting was proof that evolution was false, according to the reporter, which was, I mean, it's not like this grand reveal or anything, but it's a unique little, like, okay, aliens means evolution is wrong. That was interesting
perspective that he had, huh? All right, let's go over here to who we got left. Lance. Excuse me, Lance Sternberg. Thank you so much for being here as well. 1960s you got to cover, and I was teasing him. You know, everybody always talks about peace in the 1960s, but I'm sure you learned a lot more about the 60s than what you thought was there.
Yeah, so I mean, I left at the chance to take the 60s, mainly thinking that I could cover the centennial celebrations and really take a look at that. But it turned out to be really the university was kind of a microcosm of the society at large. When you read previous published publications of the university's history, they're very administrative, very top-down. It lacks a student voice.
Right.
And so finding that voice is really the direction that my project took. Not only student voice, but the voice of a community that was overtaken in the decades preceding and especially during this time. So through looking at the College Chronicle and the St. Cloud Daily Times, you find the voice of student activism, civil rights movements on campus, Vietnam protests. I mean, you've got the generalization or the common conceptions of, you know, peace, love, the hippie movement, things like that. But also wanted to find the voice of a community. I mean, this was a time in the decade of the 60s, 7 residence halls went up on campus, and a large number of academic buildings also went up. And what a lot of people may not realize, and some of your listeners may be well aware of this, but what a lot of people may not realize is that there were houses there. There was a community that was at the front door of this university for almost its first 100 years of existence. And now that community has receded across Fifth Avenue, and you know, students walk where neighborhoods once stood. So it was really trying to find that voice of a community that receded, and the student voice that was lacking.
Yeah.
To say, what does this say about our history?
Very interesting. Can people see these? Are they going to be at the Stearns History Museum on display, or how's that going to work, Steve? Or do you guys know if anybody wants to learn more about the projects that you're doing? Are they going to be available? Are you doing presentations for us? Or
sure. We have done presentations in the past for the Husky Showcase. That was 2-3 weeks ago.
Okay.
Right? But otherwise, right now, much of what we're doing for the public eye is really going to be in academic settings, looking at putting up some boards within Stewart Hall to display our research, things like that.
Yeah.
But all of those things will move on to next year.
And too, I suppose down the road, because this is a project in transition, so in the fall again, a new crop of students will pick up, and we'll have some probably joint programming at the museum, in addition to whatever they do on campus as well. So.
It's really exciting, though. I'm really glad that you all decided to dig in and really look for what really was the nuts and bolts kind of the school, and that is digging into the students and not just the people in charge of the schools, but really what was happening in the community at those times. So thank you all for being here and sharing your stories.
Thank you for having us.
Much appreciated.
Thanks a lot, Kelly.
Blake
Kelly.
Johnson, Lance Sternberg, and Kyle Imdeck all here talking about history of St. Cloud State University.